Hi, my name is Amy Lockhart. I'm the co-director and family partner at Oceans Family Success Center in Asbury Park. And I have the pleasure to introduce Alicia DiLorenzo, and she's here to discuss adverse childhood experiences. And I'm going to turn it over to you, Alicia.
Hello, thank you so much, Amy. Thank you for the invitation to be here, and thank you for all of the participants. I apologize in advance that my neighbor, thought it was a good idea to start mowing his lawn. So if you hear anything in the background, he just didn't align his schedule with mine. So we're going to be talking about adverse childhood experiences, but in a way that I hope leaves you feeling hopeful, rather than the overwhelm that oftentimes comes with learning about this content, and grappling with how it's impacted us in our own lives, but also what we do with it to serve the children and families in our lives. So to begin, I want to just let you know that I am currently the interim deputy director at Garden State Equality, and I'm going to share my screen with you all. I come to Garden State Equality with a background in mental health as a licensed clinician, with a background in education for almost 20 years, with my own experience being a parent, and also somebody who has been on my own healing journey through the death of my mom at a young age for me, and she was quite young as well, and found healing practices that really helped me. And so I bring all of that to the work that I do now. Garden State Equality is New Jersey's largest LGBTQ org, but we recognize that trauma underscores so many of the lived experiences for LGBTQ people, but also people with multiple marginalized identities. So we know that while ACEs are common, and you'll learn that in our time together today, it also significantly impacts Black and Brown communities at disproportionate rates. So young people, Black and Latinx young people and youth experience ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, at 24% and 27% greater risks than their white peers. And so what we also know about trauma is that where there's one early adversity, there's often other ones. And so we'll unpack a bunch of these things, but at Garden State Equality, we see this as a social justice issue, and as an equality org for New Jersey, this is something that we have taken on starting in our own community in Asbury Park. And so the work that we're doing is funded by the Nicholson Foundation and in partnership with Asbury Park and the NJEA. And we're really proud of the work that's happening here. So what I'll be introducing to you is the ACEs study, the information from the ACEs study, which is the largest study of our time. There were 17,000 participants that participated in this study. And the ACEs study confirms with scientific evidence that adversity early in life increases the risk of behavioral problems, cognitive problems, relationship problems later on in life. And although the study was done with 17,000 people, predominantly those folks were white, those folks were college educated, and those folks had access to all of the best healthcare. And so it makes us question, what about other communities, and how does this impact other communities? And so we're going to dig in a little bit there as well today. What I want to also share with you is all the information that I'm going to talk about has actually been reviewed by the two co-founders of that study, Dr. Anda and Dr. Vince Folletti. And they are actually working collaboratively with New Jersey on our statewide rollout of how to address ACEs. So let's just go into a little bit about our brains and bodies. We learned about our human nervous system way back in grade school, but many of us don't often think about it. And so what's important to lift up about our nervous system is that it orchestrates all of our internal body functions. It consists of our brain and our spinal cord and all of the connections out to our organs that start to regulate our bodies in response to the world and in response to events that are happening in our lives. And so this network of communication is happening every single second in response to every single sensation that we have and experience. And so it's constantly at work in the background that we rarely pay attention to. when we think about our brain, the cells in our brain are called neurons, and they create this really robust network of communication between our brain and our body, and turns on our systems to work as we need them to. So neurobiologists who study the effects of maltreatment on the brain development, they've helped us to understand why ACEs are so powerful and the connection that early adversity has to our brain and our brain development, and then further the impact that it has on our bodies, on our physical health. So this next slide shows us these three columns, and it shows us our neural networks at these three different time periods and developmental periods. So early on at birth, you see there's the very least amount of neural networks and neural connections, because little babies really only need to know how to regulate their body temperature and let a caregiver know that they're hungry. They need to be able to regulate other systems and connect really with caregivers. Those are the networks that are at play in early at birth. And then you see the second column where you have the most robust network, okay? And so here's what's happening. At this age, young people, elementary age, they're like sponges, right? They are making networks and connections in their brain, and all of this absorption of what their experience are, their lived experiences, help build this robust neural network. And then by the time we reach puberty, you see this third column, there's not as much there that was there at elementary, but there is much more than what connections were present at birth. And the reality is that the more lived experiences we have, the more that middle column will grow. And those things that we don't experience much or we don't practice will fall off by puberty. So at the end of the day, what this is saying is that the things that we experience more often are where our networks are going to grow in our brain. And the things that we don't have as much lived experience with, we just don't practice a lot of, we don't have access to, well, those networks are going to fall away, and we're not going to develop that strong network moving beyond puberty. So imagine here for a second two worlds, and we know that every single person, every single child's life is very unique in the way that it manifests and the events that take place. No two lives are exactly the same. But for the purposes of this presentation, let's consider that there are two worlds. The top is a dangerous path, a path where there may be a lot of chaos, there may be a lot of dysfunction in the community or in the family. It may just be a chaotic and dangerous environment. And you see in the second circle there, you see this fight, flight, or freeze, which is the body's response to all of the chaos. We're either going to show up to fight this chaos and disruption, we're going to freeze and run away from it, flee and run away from it, or we're going to freeze and just not know how to deal with it and just panic. But what happens in this scenario is that people are getting primed based on their lived experiences to be able to survive the worst conditions. It may make sense then for people who've come from a really chaotic or dangerous environment that they may always be thinking about the danger that's around every corner. They may really always be kind of primed and ready for this fight, flight, or freeze. So you may see some behaviors that may seem hypervigilant, maybe even withdrawn or dissociated, impulsive, hot-tempered or edgy. These are some things that you might see from someone who has built these neural networks and these lived experiences that are very chaotic or dangerous. Now, on the flip side, you have the other world, the blue pathway at the bottom. And this is a benevolent world where there's lots of connection and nurturing and safety and access and possibility. And these folks may be really primed to survive the best conditions, but they might be vulnerable in the worst conditions. Now, here's the thing, the stress, we're only built to survive stress for 20 minutes, right? And thinking about today, many of us experience stress for much longer than 20 minutes in our day-to-day. But the body's really built just for that amount of time. And when stress hormones are continuously pushed into our body through the chemicals that are produced when we feel stress and the hormones that are impacted by stress, well, it can turn to be toxic for us, right? So this can have a toxic effect when we're just revving that engine like a car engine. We're just stepping on that gas and revving that engine of stress in our bodies. So it makes sense then, if you think about your own life, when you are stressed, how much short-tempered you are, right? Or how more easily frustrated you are. And so this stress has a toxic effect on our bodies. Now, when we think about, folks who have a hypervigilant or edgy, or may even be quick to act or emotionally detached, generally in society, we think about these folks and we think that they have, they may have found some maladaptive ways to show up in life. But that's not true. It's just simply a false narrative, because quite honestly, both brains, those from the benevolent world and those from the turbulent world, are both adapting to their environments, and their brains are adapting to those lived experiences that are building those neural networks. And so when we think about the impact that this has on folks, we have to start to think about the expectations that we put on children and on even adults about how they should be showing up in the world. At the end of the day, biology is always going to win. So if you're hardwired, your brain has been hardwired for chaos and danger and fear, well, then there are going to be certain ways that plays out. And if you are hardwired for relationships and bonding and nurturing and connection, well, then there may be other ways that this shows up. But when we put expectations on the biology of people, we run into trouble. So consider a young person, a young child who goes into school, who has experienced that upper world and that upper path. And we ask her to sit still or to share or to cooperate. And there could be this painful disconnect that is hard for everyone, not only for the child, but also for the adult in their life or the educator in their classroom. Just like emergency professionals, EMTs and fire folks and police folks and physicians and surgeons, they all learn how to survive in a world that really, has them ready to be quick to act. We teach them that, right? There's a reason why folks that go into these fields go through a boot camp, because we have to teach them the skills of how to show up in that environment. Well, similarly, for young people who've experienced a lot of trauma or adversity in their childhood, we also have to teach them ways that their brain can create new pathways and new networks to show up and be able to self-soothe and to be able to manage big emotions and to be able to get back into their thinking brains and reasoning brains. Because when we're in that fight, flight, or freeze, we really have very little access to the part of our brain that can, respond to problem solving or analyzing. And in fact, there are lots of impacts on the brain, which we'll probably get into actually in a few more slides. There are impacts on the brain when you've experienced trauma or multiple traumas in childhood. Some of the access that's cut off from our brain development. Some things like language acquisition. Some things like response to sound and noises. Cognitive functioning and thinking and analyzing, memory, right? These are some of the parts of the brain that are actually impacted. And so our expectation for young people is that they show up and they have all these skills. But if we don't take into account their biology and what has happened to them, we may just be looking through a distorted frame. And instead, we can be doing things to help them be more successful, just like we teach, and put people through boot camps. We can put young people in scenarios where they can learn how to build these skill sets. So there are sensitive periods in the brain where our interaction with adversity it'll be more impacted, but that's not the only thing that's impacted during these sensitive periods. So where our brains are also susceptible and open to nurturing and connection, right? So these sensitive periods can also be really prime times to create those kind of doses of relationship building and doses of healthy connections that will offset any trauma that young people have experienced or gone through. So each of us interprets stress a little bit differently, but ultimately what's important is that when we think about this stress on the brain, we could say that, you know, there's differences in how boys respond and how girls respond, and that, you know, this could have lasting impacts. Adversity can have lasting impacts on young people. But again, just to stress that what is also true is that there can be opportunities here, and there can be wonderful opportunities to offset trauma through our relationships and learning a few other things that I'll get to by the end of this presentation around resiliency. So we have this collective choice, right? We can continue our societal way of isolating young people, punitive approach to behavior that is not meeting our expectations, or we could pay attention to what's happened to young people. We could pay attention to these sensitive developmental periods in the brain, and we can start to do a better job of protecting children and providing the kinds of challenges and supports that may remediate earlier periods of toxic stress and ultimately promote lifelong well-being. So what are we going to choose here? What is really incredible to consider is that we are really at a time where we can make profound changes in our well-being, and collectively we can start to heal, because when we have experienced trauma collectively, our healing also has to be collective. And so we'll see the importance and the value of community in resilience building. So I want to talk a little bit here about genetics and epigenetics, and I could geek out about this for quite a while, but I will spare you from you know, my love of epigenetics. But what this slide basically is telling us is that when whole communities experience trauma, like Black and brown folks in America, and Jews in the Holocaust, and our Native American communities, that these can be passed down, these traumas can be passed down in our genes. And so the way that our genes are read and transcribed actually changes. But again, what's also true is that the ways that we show up and nurture community and nurture young people and connect with them in healthy ways also can be passed down. And that's what some more recent research is showing, that those nurturing experiences can be passed down genetically as well. So again, I want us to feel hopeful about this work and not overwhelmed by the massiveness of trauma. So the ACEs study, we just started to look at our individual responses to trauma, how our physical bodies respond. And now we're going to go more to a population health perspective around this work. So as I mentioned, this study was done in the 90s, but it's been replicated over 1,500 times. And what we know from the early research is that there's a dose relationship. So as you experience more adversity in childhood, well, there's a higher chance that you will have experiences with social and emotional challenges, health risks, disease and disability, and social problems, and early death. Now, if you're thinking about your own childhood right now, I don't want you to feel doom and gloom that, wow, these things that you've went through are going to contribute to, you know, fatality here. What is important to recognize is that this is about population health, and all people will experience the trauma that they have gone through differently. And depending on the doses of positive people and relationships and skill building that you've had access to, could have really offset a lot of the trauma that you may have experienced. This original pyramid was only created originally with the bottom purple level of this pyramid, and more recently the blue level at the very, very bottom now was added, because we know that the historical trauma component that has impacted whole communities based on discrimination and racism and intergenerational adversity plays a tremendous role in trauma. And so what we have typically done as a society is we've dealt with the top part of the pyramid. We by the time, you know, it gets out of hand, we're dealing with disease and disability and health risks, and the cost to that is we get very little on our return. But as we start to address the root, as we start to go underneath this pyramid and get to the part about the historical and intergenerational adversity and the causes of adversity in childhood, we actually have a return 16 to 1 on our dollar spent. And so this is where the important work begins. So I'm going to go past this slide, but on this slide, I wanted to point out that there were 3 main categories that were studied originally. And in those 3 categories, they broke down into 10 subsections. And so there was a survey given, and they asked questions by the time you were 18, if you had experienced any of these 10 subcategories. And for each one that you experienced, you got 1 point. So it didn't matter how severe the emotional abuse was. If you had experienced any emotional abuse, you got 1 point. And if you were physically neglected or abused over years, it didn't count each one individually. But if at any point you had any physical abuse or neglect in your life before the age of 18, you would get 1 point. Now, if you had physical abuse plus a parent that struggled with substance abuse, then you would get 2 points, and so on and so forth. So what we know about this is that ultimately ACEs are really common. 67% of the population had at least one. And what we know now is that there are more ACEs, adverse childhood experiences, than these original 10. So poverty is an adverse childhood experience. Racism and not having access to quality housing or healthcare, that's an adversity. Homelessness is an adversity for young people. COVID-19 is an early adversity. It's a trauma, and we'll see that play out in years to come, I'm sure. So these are common. They are also interrelated, and I'll dive into that in a little while. So this just kind of depicts how common and prevalent ACEs are. And this biological stress dose here, as the ACE scores goes up, on average, the exposure to the development effects or toxic stress increases. What is also important here is that they tend to cluster. And I mentioned this early on, where you have one early adversity, you oftentimes have another. So where there may be substance abuse in the house, there may also be mental illness in the family. And so here the scores become more cumulative. So we'll go through these slides quickly, but again, here is the dose response relationship. And you know what a dose response is. As you put more gas on the pedal, the car goes faster, right? As you have more experiences that are adverse in childhood, the response or the relation to health problems goes up. Here's what's important though. When you look at the 0 ACEs, they do not have 0 health problems. So folks with 0 ACEs are not immune from health problems. There's still a percentage of health problems you will experience without any ACEs. And what's also true is that if you've experienced 5 or more ACEs, you don't have a 100% chance of having health problems, right? It hovers somewhere between 50 and 60% chance there, because our lived experiences and the opportunities to interfere with trauma can happen at any time in our life. So there's a real clear connection between anxiety and depression and smoking. Because again, we're adapting to the challenges that we've experienced. And smoking, quite honestly, has the impact of reducing some anxiety and depression. And so we see this connection here to why you may smoke as a result of experiencing trauma. What's interesting though, is that while early smoking initiation happens at higher rates, like you see this far right column here, the dark blue, there's higher rates of early initiation if you've experienced trauma. What's higher is current smokers. So you're more likely to be a current smoker as an adult if you've experienced more than 4 or 5 ACEs. What's interesting here is about ACEs and alcoholism and marrying an alcoholic. While you have a greater chance, your chances go up of becoming an alcoholic if you've had more than 4 or 5 ACEs, you actually have a greater risk of marrying someone who is an alcoholic. And that shows really the impact that ACEs has on relationships, but it also tells us about the impact that ACEs has on the generational impact, and how generations are impacted by ACEs, as we see relationships also being impacted. So we see the scores of depression here. And in the last column, we see how much more impacted women are. And I think that probably has a lot to do with just the roles that we continue. Even during COVID, we see the roles that mothers and women are taking on during this pandemic, and the multiple roles. And, so many women choosing not to return to work because of the roles that we have women in typically, but also because men don't talk about mental illness. Oftentimes they don't seek treatment as often. And so that could explain why the difference in men and women. So here's some ACEs attributable problems: alcoholism, heart disease, depression, obesity, smoking, violence, intimate partner violence. We're living in a time with stunning potential to shift the trajectory of health and well-being for generations to come. And it's important for us to know all of the impacts that ACEs has on our health. Again, ACEs are common, they are interrelated, and they can be transmitted generationally. Now, going back 2 slides when I just talked about all the attributable risks, here's probably one of my favorite slides, because what we can now determine from epidemiology is the percentage of these other attributable risks that are related to ACEs. So we can connect 67% of suicides are related to early trauma. We can connect 55% of anxiety to early adversity trauma, 54% of marijuana use. So if you imagine, this hole in the middle of this wheel where trauma just kind of seeps in and starts to take over, if we plug this hole, we actually impact all of these other attributable risks. And that's the exciting part for me, because what's predictable is preventable. If we know that early trauma can predict marijuana use, anxiety, and suicide, depression, tobacco use, all of these things, well, then we can prevent that early on. And that's really the focus, is prevention. So again, here, we look at the power that we have to shift the dynamics that lead to ACEs. The ACEs study provides really straightforward information about the consequences. And honestly, there's no real true roadmap for this. It's about us coming together collectively. It's about us having a common language. It is about us sharing resources. And it is about us understanding the impact on ACEs so that we can prevent ACEs from happening to future generations. Through our collective knowledge and our collective collaboration with each other, we are the ones that are going to shift the dynamic here. We cannot wait for laws to change for us to step into our communities and make the change necessary. And that's what we're going to talk about next. So we know that there are some core protective systems that interfere with ACEs and really protect young people from the negative impacts and the statistics we just saw. And those 3 areas are capabilities, attachment and belonging, and connection to community, culture, and spirituality. When people hear about the ACEs study, they often ask about resilience, and many ACEs presentations and workshops really just focus on that ACEs study and the threats to our health, and never go past the point where we can talk about, well, what can be done about it? And that's what's a little bit different about this presentation, is really kind of digging into that component as well. People get excited about the concept of resilient, in part because it reminds us that supportive actions matter, and that while this is an overwhelming problem, and it's kind of the undiagnosed dual pandemic that's happening at the same time as COVID-19, that there are things that we can do. There are things within our families that we can change today. There are things that we can shift and change as part of our organizations and part of our communities. And so our desire for resilience leads naturally for us to search for these ways to help families and communities. So we're going to dig into each of these a little bit, but what is really important as you take away this information is that these three protective systems are best when they are nested. If you can imagine those little kind of nesting toys where they kind of fit within each other, that's what's important to remember about these core protective systems. They are most powerful when they come together and they are nested within each other. So the first one is about individual capabilities. Now, everybody has their own narrative about their life, but what's important is if the adults in the lives of young people can help them form a positive view of themselves. When we have a positive view of ourselves, it's directly connected to hope. And when we have a positive view of ourselves, it lets us know that we matter, that we're important, that we're part of something, that our life has meaning. And so helping young people find out what are their unique gifts, natural gifts that they have, and help them find opportunities to develop those gifts is an important part of resilience. Self-efficacy is this belief that what I do influences what happens to me. And while we feel, and young children feel, a lot of loss of control in their lives as they have experienced a lot of adversity, and quite honestly, who doesn't feel a lack of control in their lives right now, us included as adults, because of all the things that are happening. But simple things that we can do to help build self-efficacy, like asking young people to do tasks or chores that are meaningful and have real value for the family or community, and encouraging people to build the skills that are complex and take time to develop over time is important. This is important for us to have children feel like they are an important part of, whether that be family or community or school or a classroom. Self-regulation is another part of a skill set that we can teach young people. Just as I said, we teach people how to go through boot camp when they are in jobs like police and fire and first responders. And for young people, we can teach the skills of self-regulation. Now, if you've heard about SEL, and I am a strong supporter of SEL, but SEL is not the be-all end-all of how we need to show up for young people. And oftentimes for many Black and brown kids and youth, SEL can be kind of used to weaponize them to just be quieter or to be more on task or less disruptive. And so it's just getting young people, especially so many of our Black and brown students who are often penalized or have punitive consequences to regular adaptive responses to the experiences that they might have had, or even to discrimination and bias that they experience in their school settings, right? And so when we think about self-regulation, it's important that all kids learn this. It's important that we don't weaponize SEL, but we nest it in within these other capabilities. And so self-regulation is about our ability to gauge our emotions, to gauge our state of mind, and to keep those to have a sense of control over those big emotions that we feel while navigating social situations and other situations in life. So when we can't or we don't read the situation and adapt our behavior to it, the social aspects of life become much more difficult. So there are a number of strategies that we can help young people practice self-regulation depending on our cultural environment. These might include belly breathing or yoga or mindfulness. These are all research to have positive impacts on young people's mental health and well-being. While there are certainly there are individual capabilities that are associated with recovery and resilience, they are oftentimes the very same capabilities that do not develop well when experiencing toxic stress. So while we can individually have capabilities of self-regulation, when we're under stress, our self-regulation oftentimes goes out the window. And believing that people can just try harder, that they can just do a little bit better or work a little harder is really circular logic that's not helpful. We have to be intentional about first modeling for young people how to be competent in relationships and manage our own stress, and then teach them those skills that will help them experience that success in their life. So next we'll get to attachment and belonging. And I know I'm going to go over just by a few minutes, so bear with me here. Attachment and belonging is one of the most protective and reparative factors when it comes to toxic stress and trauma. Relationships, not only with caring adults, but competent adults. They know how to manage their stress and regulate challenges. They know how to also teach that to me. They also are empathetic and can look through my perspective and give me the benefit of the doubt, give me opportunities to practice and to mess up and to recover. So this one, relationships, is really so important, and I think is important for us to lift up as the one thing that we have access to at all times. How we choose to show up in young people's spaces and for the young people in our life matters. It matters how we have managed our own stress so that we can show up for young people who are coming to the table with big emotions. Relationships provide security and belonging, and they'll become the norm as we learn to improve our skills and competencies to be relevant and helpful during times of stress and challenges, as well as during celebration and rest. Community connection to culture and spirituality is another really important key factor to lift up here, because if we've decided to dramatically improve health and safety for this and future generations, we have got to pay attention to fostering thriving communities, building those bridges between schools and homes, building those bridges between communities and families. Fostering thriving communities is about empowerment, and this work is about empowering those most impacted by trauma and giving them the agency to create the healing that is necessary in their community. Even looking at the wisdom that already exists within a community and recognizing what's working to develop that more broadly and build the capacity of those practices within a community. And that's exactly what our work is doing and focusing on in Asbury. And I'll get to talk about that briefly in the next slide. But really, it's about investing in the people who have the most at stake, who have been most impacted by trauma, so they can be the expert leaders in their own community's healing. Because we've seen over and over again, money being thrown at communities for programs that simply have not included the community's voice. And we oftentimes see those types of approaches fail. And this approach is about going to the community, asking, building connections, building networks and social networks, and having community members be the leader of this work. So this is about community capacity, is about helping people learn, helping people manage to improve their efforts systemically, and about providing opportunities and funding, education, and direct supports to help mobilize anyone who wants to be of help. And we're so grateful that Oceans Family Success Center in Asbury is a part of our important work in Asbury. So the work around building self-healing communities happened in Washington and in Minneapolis, and they're just a little bit ahead of New Jersey, but New Jersey is actually taking the greatest leap and lead in this work. We are the fastest growing state to roll out statewide action plans for addressing adversity and ACEs. And so in the work that we're doing in Asbury, it's about bringing people together from the community to hear from them and their experiences, to ask them what has worked and what is already working in the city, and then to create opportunities to spread that learning throughout the wider community. And so that's exactly the approach that we're taking with Asbury Park Healing Together. And so leadership expansion is really about not your typical leaders, not your city council, although we have their voices at the table, and not your business owners or organization leaders, but it's about the leadership expansion from the people most impacted. It's about building up leadership and empowering those people in the community to make the greatest difference and change. And so supporting healthy communities, a healthy community process that respects cultural traditions and values, and respects the wisdom that already exists within a community is really important. And just as a rising tide lifts all boats, a high capacity community lifts all beings. In fact, when we make interventions for those most impacted, everyone benefits. So consider when you have ever walked down the sidewalk and you get to the sidewalk dip where it dips down to meet the road. Well, that was an ADA accommodation. It's made for folks who get around in wheels and wheelchairs. But I benefit from that when I push my child in, or used to, because they're not in strollers anymore, push my child in a stroller down the street. And just like in New Jersey, how we don't have to pump our gas, right? That's an ADA accommodation, but I benefit when it's snowing or raining and I don't have to get out of the car. So everyone benefits when we take interventions that focus on those most impacted. So ultimately, this change is up to us, right? There is a predictable pattern to transformative change. And it begins with discovery and communication, which leads people to clarify their values and their thinking. With new knowledge and new habits of thinking, people change the actions they take in everyday life. The collective actions of many people shape a new reality that is ratified in organizational and policy change. The truth is that people create the new reality long before our laws ever do. So change is up to us, folks, and it's shaped by our thoughts, our conversations, shifting our behaviors and actions, the way we relate with one another and in relationships with families and in communities. So there is no power for change greater than a community in discovering what it cares about. And that, my friends, is the end of our presentation. Thank you. And thank you for letting me go over. Your breaks are important. So I'm excited for you to get some time to get up and stretch.
Thank you very much, Alicia. That was an excellent presentation, gave us a lot of great new information. So thanks. So guys, we're going to take a break for 10 minutes. We're going to start promptly at 12:15. Thank you.
Thank you.